Chapter 8 talks about sexual offending that occurs in institutional settings. So research is increasingly assessing the role that the environment plays when sexual offenses are committed. So we want to think about, when we think about child sexual abuse, how that's pervasive in some situations in which adults have unguarded access to children. And we know that some people seek out either volunteer opportunities or careers in these organizations for that specific purpose. So first of all, there's little reliable data. And the most prevalent types we've seen about in the news involve teachers, clergy, scout leaders, tutors, and social workers. But empirical data here is pretty limited. It's coming from social service agencies, law enforcement, and journalists as opposed to institutions themselves. And a lot of information we have is anecdotal. So thinking about schools, we don't have any methodologically rigorous empirical studies here. They tend to be small samples, which means we can't really take the information we learn from that and generalize it to schools in general. And they do not rely on consistent definitions of sexual abuse either, or sexual behavior. The limited research that there is available says that there is verbal and visual forms of sexual misconduct that are pretty widespread. So about 7% of kids in grades 8 to 11 experienced unwanted sexual contact. 21% of those came from teachers. In terms of childcare settings, we have seen several studies in the last 20 years. And Finkelhor, who's a researcher out of UNH, estimates that 5.5 out of every 10,000 children enrolled in daycare centers and 8.9 children out of every 10,000 children and families are reported to be sexually abused. And what really makes a difference here is situational factors when there's a low staff presence. Offenders tend to be younger than 25 and single, and this tends to more likely occur in an informal care setting than a formal one. In terms of Boy Scouts, for most of Boy Scouts' existence, leaders were able to spend time alone with Scouts. In 1991, Patrick Boyle investigated the confidential files of the Boy Scouts and published his findings in a 5-part Washington Times series. Between 1971 and 1989, 416 male Scout employees were banned as a result of sexual misconduct. About a little over 1,000 cases were reported during this period, and most occurred during camping trips. Boy Scouts claimed this was not a major crisis, but Boyle argued that this was more common in Scouting than accidental deaths and serious injuries combined. So Boy Scouts now has an extensive youth protection training program. More than 50 lawsuits have been filed by boys abused prior to the implementation of the program. And as of '94, more than $15 million had been paid out, ranging from $12,000 settlements to a $1.5 million settlement. In 2010, a civil trial resulted in an $18.5 billion payout. Boy Scouts was held liable for allowing a former Scoutmaster to continue working with children after he admitted to molesting 17 boys. BSA had been keeping records on sexual abuse within BSA since soon after its inception in 1910. Between 65 and 85, they classified 1,600 individuals unfit to work with children. The jury was shown 1,200 files, although it's believed there are more than 6,000 files. Now all volunteers and employees must pass a background check, and internal policies require a minimum of 2 adults at all events and prohibits adults from being left alone with individual Scouts. So BSA has been criticized for not making the training program mandatory and for prohibiting homosexual leaders. Big Brothers Big Sister has fewer than 10 allegations per year, and they match over 220,000 children. Half of these end in conviction or an admission of guilt. Most offenders here were single, and abuse occurred during camping trips and visits to the abuser's home. They tended to target emotionally vulnerable children, and most abusers were involved in multiple organizations, providing them with access to kids in several different areas. But Big Brothers Big Sisters does have a strict screening process. In terms of athletic organizations, the Canadian Olympians found 8.6% had experienced forced sexual intercourse with an authority figure in their sport, with about 2% being under the age of 16 at the time. They tend to target vulnerable children or groom them, and victims often did not define the behavior as abusive until years later. They tended to be reluctant to report because they feared they'd be blacklisted in the sport. And over the last 10 years, we've seen 36 coaches banned by USA Swimming, which is 0.3% of coaches. So what can we do here? Well, first of all, we can recommend strong screening procedures for applicants. Standard police checks may be insufficient. We have to look at situational factors, and screening techniques must consider the match between the individual characteristics and risks inherent. So some states have passed statutes that deal with abuse by someone in what's called a position of authority. And so despite an age of consent, they might consider the sexual contact an offense, and some might consider it an aggravating factor, whereas others would require evidence of coercion. So religious institutions we tend to know a little bit more about. In terms of the Protestant faith, about 10% of clergy have been involved in sexual misconduct, with 2 to 3% having sexually abused children. There's 3 insurance companies, and they report receiving more than 260 reports of abuse of minors annually. Guide 1 has paid out $4 million. Brotherhood Mutual reported $7.8 million, and Reformation.com has 838 ministers listed as of July 2010. Southern Baptists first caught media attention in 2008 when the Times reported that the church failed to implement a pedophile database. This church doesn't have a hierarchical structure the way other churches do, which makes it more difficult to track abuse. But some feel that this autonomy is basically an excuse that allows the abuse to continue. In the Episcopalian faith, they have developed detailed procedures about education in response to abuse following a ruling holding a bishop liable for concealing a case of sexual misconduct against a woman. So all priests, staff, and lay people who work with children must participate, and this reports the names of priests suspended or dismissed in their annual yearbook. They also inform the congregation about priest misconduct. In 2003, the New York Times revealed that Jehovah's Witness policies are largely based on biblical standards. Any allegations go before a panel of male elders who hear cases privately. Reports can be considered substantiated if the child has 2 witnesses or if the abuser confesses. If the abuser confesses, the congregation is notified that the individual has been disciplined, but not the reason for which they've been disciplined, and their name is placed in a database. After 20 years, if there are no new reports, the abuser can be reappointed to a position of authority. A victim support website reports 23,000 people accused or found guilty of sexual abuse within this faith. Based on these figures, conservative worldwide estimates indicate 1 in 4 congregations house a child sexual abuser. Salt Lake Tribune claims rates comparable to rates in society at large amongst the Mormon faith. More than 40 plaintiffs have alleged church officials knew of molestation or ignored warning signs. And they've had about 3 or 4 lawsuits per year. They've established a 24-hour hotline for bishops to access information and advice when allegations of child sexual abuse arise. In the Jewish community, we don't really have any empirical evidence here, but we do have survivor organizations, and this faith has its own system of oversight. The Orthodox Jewish culture disapproves of involving secular agencies, and so they have really, because of the strict adherence to this, these cases have remained outside of the criminal justice system. Families in this faith often do not report to the criminal justice system due to strong pressure within the community in fear it will bring shame to them. There's a great deal of stigma and denial here, and they worry about repercussions to the entire family. The Catholic Church we do know a lot more about. So we see the first widespread reporting of abuse in the Roman Catholic Church is in 83 with the Reverend Gilbert Goth. He was convicted in 85 and served less than 10 years in prison. A more well-known case in Massachusetts involves James Porter, who abused more than 100 young boys in the 60s and 70s and was sentenced to 18 to 20 years in prison. John Gagan, who was killed in prison, abused over 130 young boys between 1962 and 1993. Because there was such intense media coverage here, and in particular, the Boston Globe Spotlight series, we saw higher levels of reporting. And the Roman Catholic Church commissioned an in-depth study, and they're the only religious organization to actually do this. More studies have been conducted on the Roman Catholic Church than any other faith, and prior to 2002, these studies were limited due to sample size. But early studies did still give us some insights into the abusers. Approximately 3,000 clergy have abused about 24,000 victims in the last 50 years. And this is based on information from a treatment center. The Gagan case led to widespread and sustained media attention. How can a priest commit such acts, and how can a religious organization allow it to occur? And so 2 studies were commissioned, the Nature and Scope study and the Causes and Context study. So the Nature and Scope study was 3 surveys, one at the diocese level, a cleric survey, and a victim survey. And the identities of priests and victims were kept confidential. 97% of dioceses and 63% of all religious communities responded. They found about 4% of priests from 1950 to 2002. And this peaked during the 70s and 80s, and most of these cases are reported years, often decades later. Abuses were about pastors and associate pastors for the majority of the time, and these are people with high levels of discretion and low levels of supervision, and it occurs during a wide range of activities and places. Victims were mostly male and between the ages of 11 and 14. 56% of priests reported knowing one victim, and 3.5% of priests had abused 26% of victims. Serial abusers had 10 or more victims and had been offending for an average of 20 years. The Causes and Context study wanted to explain factors associated with this crisis and why it peaked. And this is a result of, no single cause and no specific high-risk characteristics. Few of these offenders were pedophiles or driven by other paraphilias, but most exhibited poor psychosexual development, emotional congruence with children, intimacy deficits, and high levels of stressors from work. Sexual identity and sexual behavior prior to being ordained did not predict abuse because 80% of those who abused children also participated in sexual relationships with adults. Access to victims played a critical role, and in the past, these priests had significantly more access to their victims and often groomed them, justifying and excusing their behavior by shifting responsibility to the victims. The majority of these abusive priests were educated in the 40s and 50s and ordained prior to the 70s. Seminary education has developed a lot since then, which has resulted in a drop in allegations and abuse. Responses to priests have also varied by the time period and the diocese. Most leaders responded by helping the abuser and paid little attention to the victim. And by the 90s, though, we're less likely to reinstate abusers. Priests who commit child sexual abuse are similar to sex offenders in the general population, except that they experience a high level of trust and unguarded access to children. They also don't appear to be driven by a strong sexual attraction to children and tend to fit more of the regressed offender typology. So let's take a turn here to sexual abuse within prisons. And this is a complicated issue, and it can be committed by both inmates and staff. One thing to keep in mind is the Prison Rape Elimination Act prohibits consensual sexual activity. So just like minors are not able to consent to sex, inmates are not able to consent to sex as well. In the past, COs have used their discretion to determine when an incident is considered coercive. And so basically what we've relied on mostly here is self-report. So what are some primary causes of sexual assault in prison? First of all is overcrowding. We don't have enough COs, and we don't have the ability to segregate dangerous prisoners. There are no outlets for sexual impulses because the prisons are single sex, and we don't really have any legal solutions to prison rape. Laws banning sex seem to have little effect. Also, we want to think about the fact that prison rape is about power and control, and this allows someone to reinforce a sense of self, personal worth, and control. Early studies in regarded sexual assault in prisons as homosexual acts engaged in by homosexual inmates or men with weak moral character. But Sykes proposed that inmates suffer deprivations in prison, and that includes heterosexual relationships. As a result, they form their own subculture. It has its own code and roles and values, and today this culture still uses terms to describe victims and aggressors. Even when a behavior is consensual, it could still be inherently coerced. There is a power differential between inmates, and just because somebody has said yes doesn't mean that they actually wanted to consent to that behavior. They're vulnerable by virtue of the fact that they're confined, and they can't really remove themselves from the situation. And a lot of times a consensual relationship forms out of a previously coercive relationship. So the victim may be providing sex in exchange for protection. So how prevalent is this? Studies estimate between 10 and 25% of the inmate population is raped or sexually coerced while incarcerated. Most victimization studies estimate 20% of the population has been sexually victimized. Inmates state that rape is common and an accepted part of their punishment. And these rates are even higher when we're talking about juveniles that are incarcerated and mentally ill. Many are repeat victims, with 2/3 being victimized more than once, with an average of 9 assaults. And some have reported up to 100 incidents per year. The variation in statistics is due to underreporting, the fact that we don't have a common definition of sexual assault, and a misinterpretation of coerced sexual assault as being consensual. Most of these studies are small and can't be generalized to the national population. So we don't really understand sexual assault among inmates very well. So what are some reasons for underreporting? Well, the same reasons that we would see in any situation like this. Guilt and shame, lack of proof, and fear of not being believed. There's also, of course, with prison, the fear of ineffective officials, fear of reprisal, and not wanting to be placed in protective custody. Also, people don't want to be labeled as a snitch. Those who do report are often subject to increased victimization, and in order to be protected, they're isolated. Studies of inmate self-reports find older inmates and those who view themselves as weaker are more likely to report. Many departments of corrections have set up reporting hotlines and inmate education programs, but the DOC doesn't always respond appropriately. In 2002, the ACLU sued the Texas Department of Criminal Justice on behalf of an inmate who was repeatedly raped. Basically, prison officials failed to discipline the offenders or take any measures to prevent the assault. And in Farmer v. Brennan, the Supreme Court said that prison officials violate the Eighth Amendment if they deliberately disregard the occurrence of rape in prison. So how does this impact somebody? Well, prison rape constitutes a serious public health problem. First of all, there's a risk of STIs, HIV, hepatitis, and tuberculosis. And we want to keep in mind that the rate of HIV transmission is 5 to 10 times higher in prison than the general population. Sexual victimization in prison can alter the social climate of prisons, contribute to violence, and result in physical and emotional trauma. Some may attempt suicide to escape, and victims often feel perpetually vulnerable. So who are people who are likely to be victimized in prison? Physically weaker, younger, people who are known to be homosexual, suffering from developmental or mental disorders, those with substance abuse problems, if you're not gang affiliated, if you have snitched on someone, or you're known to be previously sexually assaulted. Basically here the common thread is, are you vulnerable? And once you've been marked, you're considered even more vulnerable. There is some conflicting results as to whether or not race plays a role here, but more than 90% of these assaults are interracial. There's few studies on female victims. Some argue it's mostly consensual, and about 10 to 17% of substantiated cases involved a female inmate. In 2003, the Prison Rape Elimination Act defined prison rape broadly to include coercive sexual acts, and in order to get federal funding, you have to cooperate with these requirements. So one of the things you have to do is conduct an annual study on the impact and prevalence of rape. You have to have a review panel, and which every year reviews the operation of 3 prisons with the highest incidence of prison rape and 2 with the lowest. Provides funding, establishes a National Prison Rape Reduction Commission, and publishes a final rule within 1 year after receiving the Commission's report regarding standards on detecting, preventing, reducing, and punishing prison rape. So the total number of people assaulted in prison in the past 20 years exceeds 1 million, with nearly 200,000 inmates being the victims of prison rape. PREA establishes a zero tolerance standard and makes prevention a top priority. And it does address not only staff on inmate, but inmate on inmate violence as well. But this requires the prison administration to support this, and majority of wardens believe that prison rape is not an issue in their facility. So what are some ways we could perhaps prevent sexual assault? Well, some studies recommend conjugal visits, furlough, separate housing, providing vocational, educational, and athletic programs. So conjugal visits would allow prisoners to keep their sense of masculine identity and maintain healthy bonds with family. Some concerns here, though, are on the unsupervised nature of visits and potential for visitors to bring in contraband, and the jealousy felt by an inmate that doesn't have a partner. Better screening and classification, improved staff supervision, faster and more certain punishment, increased use of single cells, and better training for inmates and staff may also help prevent sexual assault in prison. Okay, another institution where we might see sexual abuse is within the military. And rape is highly prevalent during wars and military conflicts, and it's often used as a tool of power and domination. I haven't really paid very much attention, though, to sexual violence that occurs within the military, and many military women face sexual harassment and sexual assault during their service, which is amplified during wartime. Because the culture of the military is hyper-masculine, it devalues feminine qualities, which can lead to physical and symbolic violence against women. The prevalence rates here, though, are unclear. 6.8% of women and 1.8% of men report being sexually assaulted in the military, while 4 to 9% of female military members are sexually assaulted while in the military. 1/3 didn't know how to report the abuse, and 1/5 believed it was expected in the military. Many feared being ridiculed, having their careers disrupted, and being told to, quote, get over it. And that wraps up this chapter on sexual assault, sexual offending in institutional settings.